The morning mist clung to the rolling hills surrounding Willowbrook Springs, Tennessee, like a shroud of memories that refused to lift. It was October 15, 2024, exactly 40 years since 18-year-old Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore had vanished without a trace from this quiet town nestled in the heart of the Cumberland Mountains. The anniversary always brought a heavy silence to Harmony Baptist Church of Willowbrook Springs, where Sarah's father, Pastor Jonathan David Whitmore, had once delivered sermons filled with hope and faith. Detective Catherine, Kate, Sullivan stood in the empty sanctuary, her weathered hands holding a manila folder that had grown thick with decades of false leads, dead ends, and unanswered questions. At 62, Kate had spent her entire career with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, but the Sarah Whitmore case had haunted her since she was a rookie deputy in 1984. Now, just months before her retirement, she found herself drawn back to Willowbrook Springs by a phone call that had made her heart race. Detective Sullivan. The voice belonged to Pastor Michael Thomas Harrison, who had taken over Harmony Baptist Church after Pastor Whitmore's death in 2010. I know this might sound impossible after all these years, but we found something. Something that belonged to Sarah Whitmore. The discovery had been made during the renovation of the church's old basement, a cramped space beneath the sanctuary that had served as storage for decades. Workers removing water-damaged drywall had uncovered a hidden compartment behind the furnace, a space so well concealed that it had remained untouched for 40 years. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and preserved against time and moisture, was Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore's personal diary. Kate opened the leather-bound journal with trembling fingers, her eyes falling on the first entry dated September 3, 1984, just 6 weeks before Sarah's disappearance. The handwriting was distinctly feminine, filled with the hopes and dreams of a young woman on the cusp of adulthood. Dear Diary, the first entry began, "Today I start my senior year at Willowbrook Springs High School. Everyone keeps asking what I want to do after graduation, and I keep telling them the same thing, I want to serve God with my whole heart. Daddy says I have a calling on my life, and I can feel it too. There's something stirring in my spirit, something that tells me God has big plans for me. I just pray I'm brave enough to follow wherever He leads." As Kate continued reading, she began to understand why this diary had the power to change everything. Sarah's entries revealed a young woman of extraordinary spiritual maturity, someone who had been grappling with profound questions about faith, purpose, and the darkness she sensed lurking beneath the surface of her seemingly perfect small town. The story of Sarah Whitmore's disappearance had become legend in Willowbrook Springs. On the evening of October 15, 1984, Sarah had attended youth group at Harmony Baptist Church, leading a Bible study on the Book of Esther for the younger teens. Her friend Margaret Rose Thompson, who was 17 at the time, later recalled how passionate Sarah had been that night, talking about how God sometimes called young people to stand up for truth even when it was dangerous. She kept saying that Esther was just a teenager when she saved her people, Margaret had told investigators 40 years ago. Sarah said that age doesn't matter to God when He needs someone to speak the truth. She seemed so intense that night, like she was trying to tell us something important. After youth group ended at 9:30 p.m., Sarah had walked Margaret to her car, hugging her friend tightly and saying, "Pray for me, Maggie. I might need to do something brave soon." Those were the last words anyone remembered hearing from Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore. Her parents, Pastor Jonathan and Rebecca Ann Whitmore, had expected her home by 10 p.m., but when midnight came and went with no sign of their daughter, they called the sheriff's department. Sarah's car, a 1979 blue Honda Civic, was found the next morning in the parking lot of Willowbrook Springs Cemetery, 2 miles from the church. The keys were still in the ignition, her purse was on the passenger seat, and there were no signs of struggle. For 40 years, the mystery had consumed the Whitmore family and divided the town. Some believed Sarah had run away to escape the pressures of being a pastor's daughter. Others suspected foul play but could never identify a perpetrator. The most painful theory for the Whitmore family was that Sarah had taken her own life, driven to desperation by some secret burden she couldn't share. But now, as Kate read through the diary entries, a fourth possibility began to emerge, one that was both more disturbing and more heroic than anyone had imagined. October 1, 1984. Dear Diary. I've been praying about what I discovered last week, and I keep feeling God telling me that silence is not an option. I know what I saw in Mr. Henderson's office at the lumber mill, and I know what those papers mean. People are being hurt, families are being destroyed, and money that should be helping our community is disappearing into the pockets of men who smile in church on Sunday morning. I've been studying the story of Esther again, and I understand now why God has been drawing me to her story. Sometimes He calls us to speak truth to power, even when we're young, even when we're afraid, even when it might cost us everything. Esther risked her life to save her people. What am I willing to risk to save mine? I've decided to go to Sheriff Morrison with what I know. I can't keep carrying this secret. These men think they can hide behind their positions in the church and the community, but God sees everything. He sees the widows who can't pay their heating bills while these men buy new trucks. He sees the families losing their homes while these men build swimming pools. If something happens to me, I pray that whoever finds this diary will have the courage to finish what I started. The evidence is hidden where only I know to look. May God give me strength for what comes next. Kate's hands shook as she read the entry. Sarah hadn't been running away or struggling with depression. She had been preparing to expose corruption that reached to the highest levels of Willowbrook Springs society. The diary revealed a conspiracy involving the lumber mill, the bank, and several prominent church members who had been embezzling money meant for community development projects. But more shocking still were the names Sarah had recorded. Some of the men she identified as part of the conspiracy were still alive, still respected members of the community, still serving on church boards and town councils. For 40 years, they had attended memorial services for Sarah Whitmore, had comforted her grieving parents, had helped organize search efforts, all while knowing exactly what had happened to the brave young woman who had threatened to expose their crimes. As Kate closed the diary and looked around the empty sanctuary where Sarah had worshipped and served, she felt a familiar fire igniting in her chest. This wasn't just about solving a cold case anymore. This was about honoring the memory of a courageous young woman who had been willing to risk everything for the truth. Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore deserved justice, and Kate Sullivan was going to make sure she got it. The first person Kate needed to talk to was Margaret Rose Thompson, now Margaret Rose Campbell, who still lived in Willowbrook Springs and served as a Sunday school teacher at Harmony Baptist Church. If anyone could help piece together Sarah's final weeks, it would be her best friend. Margaret met Kate at the church that afternoon, her silver hair catching the autumn sunlight as they walked through the cemetery where Sarah's car had been found 40 years ago. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as Kate shared what they had discovered in the diary. "I always knew Sarah was keeping something from me those last few weeks," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. She seemed burdened by something heavy, but whenever I asked her about it, she would just say she was praying about a difficult situation. I should have pressed her more. I should have been a better friend. "Margaret," Kate said gently, "there's nothing you could have done. Sarah was protecting you by not telling you what she knew. But now we need your help. Do you remember anything unusual from those final weeks? Any conversations, any meetings, anything that seemed out of place?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her eyes scanning the headstones that marked the graves of community members who had passed away over the decades. Finally, she spoke. "There was something," she said slowly. "The night before Sarah disappeared, she asked me to meet her at Miller's Creek after school. She seemed nervous, kept looking over her shoulder like she thought someone was watching us. She gave me a small package wrapped in brown paper and told me to keep it safe, that if anything ever happened to her, I should give it to someone in law enforcement who wasn't from Willowbrook Springs." Kate's pulse quickened. "Do you still have the package?" "I kept it for years," Margaret replied. "When nothing happened to Sarah, I eventually forgot about it. But after she disappeared, I was so scared, Detective Sullivan. I was 17 years old, and I didn't know who to trust. Sarah had been so specific about giving it to someone from outside town. I hid it in my hope chest and eventually forgot about it when I got married and moved away for a few years." "Margaret," Kate said urgently, "we need to find that package. It could be the evidence Sarah was referring to in her diary." They drove immediately to Margaret's house, a modest two-story home on Maple Street that she had inherited from her parents. In the attic, covered in dust and surrounded by Christmas decorations and old photo albums, was the cedar hope chest Margaret had received for her 16th birthday. With trembling hands, Margaret lifted the lid and began removing quilts, tablecloths, and other treasures she had saved over the years. At the very bottom, wrapped in the same brown paper from 40 years ago, was Sarah's package. Inside were photocopied documents, bank statements, and handwritten notes in Sarah's careful script. The papers detailed a complex embezzlement scheme involving Charles Bradford Henderson, owner of Henderson Lumber Mill, Robert Eugene Morrison, who had been sheriff of Willowbrook Springs from 1980 to 1990, Thomas William Davies, president of First National Bank of Willowbrook Springs, and Elder James Patrick Sullivan of Harmony Baptist Church. The four men had been systematically stealing money from federal grants meant to improve infrastructure in rural Tennessee communities. They had created fake construction projects, inflated costs for real projects, and funneled the money into private accounts. Over a 5-year period, they had stolen nearly $2 million, a fortune in 1984 dollars. Sarah's notes revealed how she had discovered the scheme. She had been working part-time at Henderson Lumber Mill, filing paperwork and answering phones to earn money for college. While organizing files one day, she had noticed discrepancies between the invoices being sent to the federal government and the actual work being performed. Her natural curiosity and keen intellect had led her to investigate further, and she had gradually uncovered the full scope of the conspiracy. What made the discovery even more heartbreaking was Sarah's own internal struggle, documented in her diary entries. She had been particularly devastated to learn that Elder Sullivan, no relation to Detective Kate Sullivan, had been involved. James Patrick Sullivan had been like a grandfather to Sarah, had baptized her when she was 12, and had encouraged her spiritual growth throughout her teenage years. September 28, 1984. Dear Diary. I confronted Elder Sullivan today after church. I showed him the documents and asked him to explain. I thought maybe there was some misunderstanding, some way this could all be innocent. I wanted so badly to be wrong. But when he saw the papers, his face went white, and then he got angry. He told me I was meddling in things I didn't understand, that there were bigger issues at play than a naive little girl could comprehend. He said the money was being used for good purposes, just not the official ones, and that sometimes good people had to work around bureaucratic red tape to help their community. I asked him how buying new trucks and building swimming pools was helping our community. I asked him about Mrs. Patterson, who can't afford her medication, and the Johnson family, who lost their farm because they couldn't get the loan they needed. His answers made me sick to my stomach. Elder Sullivan grabbed my arm, hard enough to leave bruises, and told me that if I knew what was good for me and my family, I would forget what I had seen. He said accidents happen to young people who didn't know when to keep their mouths shut. I'm scared, Diary. But I'm also angry. These men have been stealing from our community while sitting in the front pews of our church, singing hymns and taking communion. How can they live with themselves? How can they look at the struggling families in our congregation and not feel ashamed? I've made my decision. I'm going to the state police tomorrow. I don't care what Elder Sullivan threatened. I don't care if it destroys my reputation or my family's standing in the community. Some things are more important than keeping the peace. As Kate read Sarah's final diary entries, the pieces of the 40-year-old puzzle finally began to fall into place. Sarah had been murdered not by a random predator or in a moment of passion, but by men who had calculated that silencing one brave teenager was worth preserving their lucrative criminal enterprise. The last entry in Sarah's diary was dated October 15, 1984, the day she disappeared. Dear Diary. Today is the day. I've prayed about this all night, and I have perfect peace about what I need to do. I've hidden copies of all the evidence in a place where they'll eventually be found, even if something happens to me. I've given another set to Margaret, though she doesn't know what's in the package. I'm scared, but I keep thinking about David facing Goliath. I keep thinking about Daniel in the lion's den. I keep thinking about Jesus, who could have called down angels to save him but chose to suffer for the truth instead. If these are my last words, I want whoever reads them to know that I don't regret speaking up. Our community deserves better than corrupt leaders who steal with one hand while they take communion with the other. I may be just 18 years old, but I know right from wrong, and I know that God expects his people to stand up for justice. Tell my parents I love them. Tell them I died trying to do what Jesus would do. Tell them that even if my body isn't found, my soul is safe in the arms of my Savior. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid, do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. Joshua 1 verse 9. This is my verse. This is my strength. This is my hope. If you're reading this, please don't let my death be meaningless. Finish what I started. Make sure the truth comes to light. Make sure justice is done. Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore, daughter of the king. Kate closed the diary and sat in silence for a long moment, overwhelmed by the courage and faith of a young woman who had been willing to sacrifice everything for the truth. Margaret sat beside her, tears streaming down her face as she processed the magnitude of what they had discovered. She knew, Margaret whispered. She knew they were going to kill her, and she did it anyway. She was braver than most adults I've known, Kate replied, her voice thick with emotion. But now we have work to do. These men may be old, but they're not all dead. And they're going to face justice for what they did to Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore. The weight of Sarah's diary pressed heavily on Detective Kate Sullivan's mind as she drove back to her office in Nashville that evening. 40 years of careful planning, cover-ups, and false narratives were about to come crashing down around the men who had murdered an innocent young woman. But Kate knew that building a solid case after 4 decades would require meticulous police work and careful strategy. Her first call was to District Attorney Patricia Monroe Williams, a seasoned prosecutor who specialized in cold cases and had built her reputation on bringing justice to families who had waited decades for answers. Kate had worked with Patricia on several high-profile cases over the years and trusted her completely. "Patricia, I need you to clear your schedule for the next few days," Kate said without preamble when the DA answered her phone. "I'm about to hand you the biggest case of your career." Patricia Monroe Williams was intrigued. She had known Kate Sullivan for 15 years and had never heard the veteran detective sound so simultaneously excited and somber. As Kate explained the discovery of Sarah's diary and the evidence it contained, Patricia felt her own pulse quicken. This wasn't just about solving a cold case, this was about exposing a conspiracy that had corrupted an entire community for generations. "Kate, some of these men are still alive?" Patricia asked, reviewing the names Kate had provided over the phone. 3 of the 4, Kate confirmed. Charles Bradford Henderson is 87 and living in a luxury retirement community in Knoxville. Robert Eugene Morrison is 85 and still lives in Willowbrook Springs. Can you believe that? He actually had the audacity to stay in town after murdering Sarah. And Thomas William Davies is 89 and in a nursing home in Memphis. What about the 4th man? James Patrick Sullivan died in 1995. Natural causes, according to his death certificate. But Kate's voice carried a note of satisfaction. "I don't think God let him escape justice entirely. The man spent his final years battling Alzheimer's disease. Margaret Campbell told me he spent months before his death calling out Sarah's name, asking for forgiveness from someone who wasn't there." Patricia was already making notes, her legal mind racing through the complexities of prosecuting octogenarians for a 40-year-old murder. "Kate, you know the challenges we're facing here. The statute of limitations, the ages of the defendants, the fact that our primary witness is dead." "Patricia," Kate interrupted, "I've been thinking about this all afternoon. Yes, it will be challenging. But we have Sarah's diary, written in her own hand, detailing the threats she received. We have the financial documents she photocopied, which will be easy to verify against bank records from 1984. And most importantly, we have the fact that her body was never found." Kate's voice grew more determined as she continued. These men have been living free for 40 years while Sarah's parents went to their graves never knowing what happened to their daughter. Pastor Jonathan Whitmore died in 2010, and his wife Rebecca died in 2015. They spent 31 and 36 years respectively wondering if their daughter had run away because they had somehow failed her as parents. The emotional weight of the case was not lost on Patricia. As a mother herself, she couldn't imagine the agony of losing a child and never knowing the truth. "All right, Kate. I'm in. But we need to be smart about this. If these men realize we're investigating them, they might flee or destroy additional evidence." "Already thought of that," Kate replied. "I want to start with Charles Henderson. He's the oldest and most isolated. If we can get him to confess, we can use his testimony against the others." The next morning, Kate and Patricia drove to Sunset Manor, the upscale retirement community in Knoxville where Charles Bradford Henderson had been living for the past 7 years. The facility was elegant and expensive, the kind of place that required significant financial resources to afford. It was fitting, Kate thought grimly, that Henderson was living in luxury purchased with money stolen from struggling families in Willowbrook Springs. Henderson was in the facility's library when they found him, reading a large print Bible and looking like a harmless elderly gentleman. At 87, he was thin and frail, his white hair carefully combed and his clothes neat and pressed. He looked up with mild curiosity when Kate and Patricia approached his table. "Mr. Henderson?" Kate said, showing her badge. "I'm Detective Kate Sullivan with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, and this is District Attorney Patricia Williams. We'd like to speak with you about some events that occurred in Willowbrook Springs in 1984. The color drained from Henderson's face so quickly that Kate thought he might faint. His hands, which had been steady while holding his Bible, began to tremble violently. I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered. "I'm an old man. My memory isn't what it used to be." Patricia leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Mr. Henderson, we've discovered some new evidence regarding the disappearance of Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore. I think you remember her quite well." Henderson's breathing became rapid and shallow. He looked around the library as if searching for an escape route, but they were the only people in the room. After a long moment, he seemed to deflate like a balloon losing air. "How?" he whispered. "How did you find out?" "Sarah was much braver and smarter than you gave her credit for," Kate replied. "She documented everything. She made sure the truth would come out eventually, even if it took 40 years. Henderson closed his Bible and placed his trembling hands on top of it. "I've been carrying this burden for 4 decades, he said, his voice barely audible. "There hasn't been a single day when I haven't thought about that girl. Not one day when I haven't regretted what we did." "Then help us understand what happened," Patricia said. "Help us give her family the closure they deserved." Henderson was quiet for several minutes, his eyes fixed on the Bible beneath his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of 40 years of guilt and shame. "It wasn't supposed to happen," he began. "We never intended to hurt anyone. The money, we told ourselves we were just borrowing it, that we'd pay it back when the mill became profitable again. The lumber business was struggling in the early 80s, and I was facing bankruptcy." Kate listened without interruption, knowing that any sudden movement or comment might cause Henderson to stop talking. "Robert Morrison came to me with the idea," Henderson continued. "He said there were federal grants available for rural development projects, but the paperwork was complicated and the oversight was minimal. He suggested we could inflate some costs, create some fictional projects, and use the money to keep our businesses afloat until the economy improved." "And the others?" Patricia prompted. "Tom Davies at the bank helped us set up the accounts and move the money around. James Sullivan, he was the one who gave us credibility. People trusted him because he was an elder at the church. If James Sullivan was involved in a project, people assumed it was legitimate and godly." Henderson's voice broke as he continued. "We told ourselves we were helping the community by keeping local businesses open, by preserving jobs. We promised each other we'd pay every penny back with interest. But once we started, it became easier to justify taking more. "Tell us about Sarah," Kate said quietly. Henderson's hands gripped his Bible tighter. "She was so young, so full of righteousness and fire. When she came to me with those documents, I panicked. I tried to explain that things weren't as simple as they seemed, that sometimes good people had to make hard choices. But she wouldn't listen. So you killed her?" "No." Henderson's voice was sharp, then immediately dropped to a whisper as he remembered where he was. "I mean, I didn't personally, it wasn't my idea." "Whose idea was it?" Patricia pressed. Henderson was crying now, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "Robert Morrison said she was going to destroy all of us. He said if she went to the state police, we'd all go to prison and our families would be ruined. He said we had to protect ourselves." "How did you do it?" Henderson's confession came in broken sentences, interrupted by sobs and long pauses. The story that emerged was both calculating and cowardly. The four men had agreed that Sarah posed an unacceptable threat to their criminal enterprise. Sheriff Morrison had used his position to monitor Sarah's movements and had learned that she planned to drive to the state police barracks in Cookeville on the morning of October 16, 1984. On the night of October 15, after Sarah finished leading youth group at Harmony Baptist Church, Morrison had approached her in the church parking lot. He had told her there was an emergency at the cemetery, that someone had been vandalizing graves and he needed her to come with him to assess the damage to see if any church property had been affected. Sarah, trusting the sheriff and concerned about protecting her church, had followed Morrison to the cemetery in her own car. There, the other three men were waiting. They had tried one final time to convince Sarah to remain silent, offering her money for college and promising that they would gradually pay back what they had stolen. "She was so brave," Henderson sobbed. "Even when she realized what was happening, even when she knew we weren't going to let her leave, she looked us in the eyes and told us that God would bring justice even if we killed her. She said the truth would come out eventually because God doesn't let evil triumph forever." James Sullivan, the church elder Sarah had trusted like a grandfather, had been the one to strangle her. The others had watched in horror as the life left the eyes of the young woman they had known since she was a child. But rather than stopping the crime or confessing immediately, they had compounded their sin by disposing of her body and covering up their crime. "We put her in the trunk of Morrison's police car," Henderson whispered. "He knew places in the mountains where no one would ever find her. We made it look like she had abandoned her car at the cemetery and run away. Morrison handled the investigation, made sure it never went anywhere." "Where is her body?" Kate asked, though she dreaded the answer. Henderson shook his head. "I don't know. Morrison never told us. He said it was better if we didn't know, that way we couldn't accidentally reveal anything. All he said was that she was somewhere the wild animals couldn't get to her, somewhere she would rest peacefully." The confession session lasted for 3 hours, with Henderson providing details that only someone who had been present could have known. Patricia recorded everything, and Henderson signed a formal statement admitting his role in Sarah's murder and the conspiracy that had led to it. As they prepared to leave Sunset Manor, Henderson grabbed Kate's arm with surprising strength. "Detective," he said urgently, "there's something else you need to know. Morrison kept trophies." Kate's blood ran cold. "What kind of trophies?" "Sarah was wearing a silver cross necklace the night we killed her. Morrison took it off her body before they disposed of her. He said he wanted something to remember her by, to remind him why what we did was necessary. I saw him wearing it under his shirt at church services for years afterward." Kate felt sick to her stomach, but she forced herself to remain professional. "Is he still wearing it?" Henderson nodded. "As far as I know. I haven't seen Morrison in person for several years, but Margaret Campbell mentioned seeing it when she visited his wife before she died. The sick bastard has been wearing a murdered girl's necklace to church for 40 years. As Kate and Patricia drove back toward Willowbrook Springs, they sat in silence for the first hour, both processing the magnitude of what they had just learned. Finally, Patricia spoke. "Kate, we need to move quickly now. If word gets out that Henderson confessed, Morrison might flee or destroy evidence. Agreed, Kate replied. But I want to search Morrison's house while he's not there. If he's kept other trophies or evidence, I want to find it before we arrest him. They coordinated with the local sheriff's department, carefully avoiding anyone who might have connections to Morrison, and obtained search warrants for both Morrison's home and Charles Henderson's former residence in Willowbrook Springs, which was now owned by his son. The search of Morrison's house was conducted the next day while the 85-year-old former sheriff was at his weekly doctor's appointment. Kate had never felt more focused or determined as she and her team systematically went through 40 years' worth of accumulated possessions. They found Sarah's cross necklace exactly where Henderson had said it would be, in Morrison's bedroom, hanging from a hook inside his closet, almost like a Sikh shrine. But that wasn't the most disturbing discovery. In a locked filing cabinet in Morrison's basement office, they found a manila folder labeled SW, 1984. Inside the folder were photographs of Sarah's body, taken before disposal. There were also newspaper clippings about her disappearance, memorial service programs, and even sympathy cards that Morrison had sent to Pastor Jonathan and Rebecca Whitmore over the years. Most chilling of all was a handwritten journal Morrison had kept, documenting his thoughts and feelings about the murder. November 15, 1984, 1 month. Still no real leads on the Sarah Whitmore case. The state boys came down to help with the investigation, but I've been able to steer them away from anything useful. Told them it looks like a runaway situation. The girl was under a lot of pressure as a pastor's kid, probably just needed to get away from expectations. Jonathan Whitmore is falling apart. Had to console him again yesterday when he broke down in my office. Told him not to give up hope, that we'd keep looking for his daughter. The irony would be funny if it wasn't so pathetic. July 4, 1985. Independence Day. Went to the church picnic today. Rebecca Whitmore hugged me and thanked me for all the work I've done trying to find Sarah. Said she doesn't know what they would have done without my support during this difficult time. I almost laughed. Sometimes I take out Sarah's necklace and look at it. Not because I miss her, the little bitch got what she deserved for threatening my family's security. But because it reminds me that I'm smarter than everyone else in this pathetic town. They all think I'm their protector, their servant. They have no idea that I'm the one who eliminated their precious little angel. December 24, 1995. James Sullivan died yesterday. Alzheimer's finally got him. He'd been talking about Sarah for months, calling out her name, apologizing to empty rooms. The nurses at the care facility said he seemed to think she was visiting him, that he could see her standing at the foot of his bed. I'm not superstitious, but I have to admit that James's final months were disturbing. Sometimes when I'd visit him, he'd look right through me and start crying, saying, she's here, she knows what we did. Creepy old bastard. Glad he's finally gone. Maybe now the nightmares will stop. October 15, 2004, 20 years. Another anniversary of our little problem being solved. 20 years, and nobody has ever come close to figuring out what really happened. I've gotten good at playing the part of the concerned former sheriff, the man who still wonders what happened to poor Sarah Whitmore. Saw Margaret Campbell at the grocery store today. She was buying flowers to put on Sarah's memorial grave marker. Asked me if I thought they'd ever find out what happened. Told her I hoped so, for the family's sake. She has no idea she was talking to Sarah's killer. I'm thinking about writing a book when I retire. Unsolved, the cases that haunted my career. Sarah's case could be the centerpiece. The mysterious disappearance of a pastor's daughter that stumped everyone. I could be the grieving law enforcement officer who never gave up hope. The perfect crime, told by the perfect criminal. Kate had to step outside Morrison's house twice while reading his journal, overwhelmed by the casual cruelty and narcissistic pride the man had displayed over 4 decades. This wasn't someone who had committed a crime in a moment of panic and spent years regretting it. This was a predator who had enjoyed his power over Sarah's family and the entire community. But the journal also provided crucial information about the location of Sarah's body. In several entries, Morrison had referenced the old mine and the place where she can't be found. Kate immediately contacted local mining experts and historical societies to identify abandoned mines in the area that would have been accessible in 1984. The search focused on Sunset Ridge, a mountainous area about 20 miles from Willowbrook Springs that had been extensively mined for coal in the early 1900s. Several old mine shafts had been sealed by the state in the 1960s and 1970s, but Morrison would have known their locations from his work as sheriff. On November 3, 2024, exactly 40 years and 19 days after Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore's disappearance, a search team found her remains in a sealed mine shaft on Sunset Ridge. She had been wrapped in a tarp and lowered nearly 100 feet into the abandoned mine, then covered with rocks and debris. Despite 4 decades in the ground, enough remained for the medical examiner to confirm the cause of death as strangulation and to positively identify the body through dental records. Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore was finally coming home. The arrest of Robert Eugene Morrison sent shockwaves through Willowbrook Springs that reverberated far beyond the small Tennessee town. For 40 years, Morrison had been a respected member of the community, serving not only as sheriff for a decade but also as a deacon at Harmony Baptist Church, a member of the school board, and a volunteer with numerous charitable organizations. The revelation that he had murdered Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore and spent 4 decades manipulating her grieving family shattered the trust and faith of an entire community. Kate Sullivan and her team arrested Morrison at his home on November 5, 2024, just 2 days after Sarah's body was discovered. Despite his advanced age, Morrison was surprisingly spry for 85, and Kate half expected him to attempt an escape or resist arrest. Instead, he sat calmly in his living room chair while Kate read him his rights, his expression showing neither surprise nor remorse. "I suppose Charles finally broke," Morrison said as Kate finished the Miranda warning. "The old fool never had the stomach for what needed to be done." Kate studied Morrison's face, looking for any sign of humanity or regret. She found neither. "Mr. Morrison, you have the right to remain silent. I strongly suggest you use that right until you speak with an attorney." Morrison laughed, a sound that chilled Kate to her core. "Attorney? Detective Sullivan, I'm 85 years old. Even if you convict me tomorrow, I'll be dead before I serve any meaningful time. Do you think I'm afraid of your legal system?" As they led Morrison away in handcuffs, neighbors gathered on their porches and sidewalks, watching in stunned silence as a man they had trusted and respected for decades was arrested for murdering the young woman they had spent 40 years mourning. Several elderly residents wept openly, understanding that their entire perception of their community and its history had been built on lies. Margaret Rose Campbell arrived at the police station within an hour of Morrison's arrest, having driven directly from her job at the elementary school where she worked as a librarian. Kate had called her personally to inform her of the arrest before the news broke publicly, knowing that Margaret deserved to hear the truth from someone who understood the significance of this moment. 40 years, Margaret whispered as she sat in the station's conference room, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had grown cold. "For 40 years, I've been carrying around guilt because I thought I should have done more to help Sarah, should have pressed her to tell me what was wrong. All this time, she was protecting me by not telling me everything." Kate nodded, understanding the complex emotions Margaret was experiencing. "Sarah knew that knowledge would put you in danger. By keeping you partially in the dark, she probably saved your life." "But Detective Sullivan," Margaret said, her voice breaking, "how many times did I shake hands with Robert Morrison at church? How many times did I thank him for all the work he did trying to find Sarah? How many times did I pray for God to bless him for his dedication to our community?" The question hung in the air, highlighting the profound betrayal that Morrison's crimes represented. He hadn't just murdered a young woman, he had spent 4 decades masquerading as a righteous man while torturing her family and friends with false hope and misdirected gratitude. Pastor Michael Thomas Harrison was equally devastated by the revelations. As the current pastor of Harmony Baptist Church, he had spent the past 14 years ministering to a congregation that included Sarah's killer. Morrison had sat in the sanctuary every Sunday, had taken communion, had participated in prayer circles, had even helped organize memorial services for Sarah on significant anniversaries. How do I process this? Pastor Harrison asked Kate during a private meeting at the church. How do I explain to my congregation that we've been worshiping alongside a murderer for decades? How do I help them reconcile their faith with the knowledge that evil can hide so effectively behind a mask of righteousness? Kate had no easy answers. Her own faith had been tested by the crimes she had investigated over the years, but the Morrison case challenged her understanding of human nature in ways she had never experienced. Pastor, I think Sarah's diary might provide some guidance. Even knowing she was going to die, even facing unimaginable evil, she never lost her faith in God's ultimate justice. Maybe that's the message your congregation needs to hear. The media attention surrounding the case was intense but respectful. Sarah's story resonated with people across the country who saw her as a symbol of courage and integrity. The image of an 18-year-old girl willing to risk everything to expose corruption struck a chord in an era when many people felt cynical about justice and truth. Documentary filmmakers, true crime podcasters, and journalists from major networks descended on Willowbrook Springs, all wanting to tell Sarah's story. Pastor Harrison worked with Margaret Campbell and Kate Sullivan to ensure that any media coverage honored Sarah's memory and focused on her courage rather than sensationalizing the details of her murder. One of the most poignant interviews was with Margaret Campbell, who spoke about her friend's character and faith. Sarah wasn't trying to be a hero, Margaret told a reporter from CNN. She was just a young woman who couldn't stand by and watch while people were being hurt. She saw families struggling to pay their bills while these men bought luxury items with stolen money, and her conscience wouldn't let her remain silent. That's who Sarah was, someone who would rather risk everything than compromise her principles. The legal proceedings against Morrison moved quickly, partly due to the strength of the evidence and partly because of Morrison's age and health. Patricia Monroe Williams built an airtight case using Henderson's confession, Morrison's own journal entries, the financial documents Sarah had preserved, and the physical evidence found in Morrison's home. Morrison's attorney, a young public defender named David Richardson, faced an impossible task. His client had essentially confessed to the crime in his own handwriting, had kept trophies from the murder, and showed no remorse for his actions. Richardson's only viable strategy was to argue for leniency based on Morrison's age and the amount of time that had passed since the crime. Your Honor, Richardson argued during the sentencing hearing, my client is an 85-year-old man who poses no threat to society. Sending him to prison at this stage of his life serves no rehabilitative purpose and little deterrent effect. Patricia Williams's response was swift and powerful. Your Honor, Robert Morrison has spent 40 years as a free man while Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore lay in an unmarked grave. He has attended her memorial services, consoled her parents, and accepted the community's gratitude for his supposed efforts to find her. He has shown no remorse, no repentance, and no acknowledgement of the profound suffering he caused. Justice delayed is not justice denied, and Sarah Whitmore deserves to have her killer held accountable, regardless of how much time has passed. The judge, 67-year-old Rebecca Martinez, had presided over hundreds of criminal cases during her career, but few had affected her as deeply as Sarah's story. Before pronouncing sentence, she addressed Morrison directly. Mr. Morrison, you were sworn to protect and serve the people of Willowbrook Springs, but instead you betrayed that trust in the most heinous way possible. You murdered an innocent young woman whose only crime was believing in justice and having the courage to speak truth to power. You then spent 40 years compounding that evil by manipulating her family's grief and accepting their gratitude for your supposed efforts to find their daughter. Judge Martinez paused, looking directly at Morrison, who sat unmoved in his wheelchair. You have shown no remorse for your actions, no acknowledgement of the pain you caused, and no respect for the life you took. While your age prevents me from imposing the sentence you truly deserve, I hereby sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Morrison's reaction to the sentence was characteristic of the man he had revealed himself to be. He shrugged slightly and muttered, I'll be dead in 2 years anyway. This changes nothing. But he was wrong. The exposure of the truth changed everything for the people who had been affected by Sarah's death and the subsequent cover-up. Charles Bradford Henderson died 3 weeks after Morrison's sentencing, apparently succumbing to the stress and guilt of finally confronting his crimes. His family donated his considerable estate to a scholarship fund for students from Willowbrook Springs who demonstrated the kind of moral courage Sarah had shown. Thomas William Davies, the former bank president, was deemed too ill to stand trial due to advanced dementia. He died in his nursing home 6 months later, his final weeks marked by agitation and calls for forgiveness from someone named Sarah. The ripple effects of the case extended far beyond the immediate participants. The state of Tennessee launched a comprehensive review of rural development grants from the 1980s, uncovering additional instances of fraud and corruption that had gone undetected for decades. Several other communities discovered that they too had been victims of similar schemes, leading to additional investigations and prosecutions. For Margaret Rose Campbell, the resolution of Sarah's case brought both closure and a renewed sense of purpose. She worked with Pastor Harrison to establish the Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore Foundation, an organization dedicated to supporting young people who demonstrated moral courage in difficult circumstances. Sarah taught me that sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing to do, Margaret said during the foundation's inaugural fundraising dinner. She knew the risks of speaking up, but she also knew the cost of remaining silent. I want other young people to know that when they choose to stand for truth and justice, they're following in the footsteps of a true hero. The most emotional moment of the entire ordeal came when Sarah's body was finally laid to rest in Willowbrook Springs Cemetery, just a few hundred yards from where her car had been found 40 years earlier. Hundreds of people attended the funeral service, including many who had never met Sarah but had been inspired by her story. Pastor Harrison delivered the eulogy, speaking about Sarah's faith, courage, and the ultimate triumph of truth over evil. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when Margaret Campbell read from Sarah's diary, sharing her friend's own words about faith, justice, and the willingness to sacrifice for what is right. Sarah wrote, "I may be just 18 years old, but I know right from wrong, and I know that God expects His people to stand up for justice," Margaret read, her voice strong despite her tears. Today, 40 years later, we see that Sarah was right. Truth has prevailed. Justice has been served. And her courage continues to inspire others to stand up for what is right. As Sarah's casket was lowered into the ground, Kate Sullivan stood among the mourners and reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The case had consumed her final months before retirement, but she knew that solving Sarah's murder was the most important work she had ever done. After the service, Kate approached Sarah's grave marker, which bore the inscription, "Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore, daughter, friend, truth-teller, her courage echoes through eternity." She placed a single white rose on the fresh earth and whispered a prayer of gratitude for a young woman whose faith and courage had reached across 4 decades to ensure that justice would ultimately prevail. 5 years after Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore's body was finally laid to rest, Willowbrook Springs had transformed from a community haunted by an unsolved mystery into a town defined by its commitment to truth, justice, and moral courage. The revelation of Sarah's murder and the corruption that led to it had shattered many illusions, but it had also created an opportunity for genuine healing and renewal. Detective Kate Sullivan, now 72 and 5 years into her retirement, had moved to Willowbrook Springs permanently, drawn by the community's spirit of redemption and her own connection to Sarah's story. She had purchased a small house on Elm Street, just 3 blocks from Harmony Baptist Church, and had become a regular attendee at Sunday services, something that surprised everyone who knew her, including herself. "I never considered myself a particularly religious person," Kate told Pastor Michael Harrison during one of their regular coffee meetings at Miller's Cafe. But watching how this community responded to the truth about Sarah, seeing how faith sustained her even in the face of death, it changed something in me. Pastor Harrison nodded, understanding the profound impact that Sarah's story had on everyone who encountered it. Sarah's legacy isn't just about solving a murder or exposing corruption. It's about the power of truth to heal and transform communities, even when that truth is painful. The Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore Foundation had grown beyond anyone's expectations, providing scholarships to young people who demonstrated moral courage and supporting organizations that worked to expose corruption and protect whistleblowers. Margaret Rose Campbell, now serving as the foundation's executive director, had overseen the distribution of over $2 million in grants and scholarships over the past 5 years. One of the foundation's most impactful programs was the annual Sarah Whitmore Courage Award, presented to individuals who had risked personal safety or security to expose wrongdoing or protect others. Recipients included corporate whistleblowers, journalists who had uncovered government corruption, and everyday citizens who had stood up to bullies or criminals in their communities. The 2029 recipient was Maria Elena Rodriguez, a young woman from El Paso, Texas, who had exposed a scheme by local officials to divert federal disaster relief funds intended for hurricane victims. Like Sarah, Maria had discovered the corruption through her work, in her case, as a clerk in the city planning office, and had faced threats and intimidation when she tried to report what she had found. Sarah Whitmore's story gave me the courage to keep going when I wanted to give up, Maria said during her acceptance speech at the foundation's annual dinner. Knowing that an 18-year-old girl in Tennessee had been willing to sacrifice everything for the truth helped me find the strength to do what was right, even when I was scared. The foundation had also funded the creation of the Whitmore Center for Ethical Leadership at the University of Tennessee, where students studied the intersection of moral courage, public service, and faith-based activism. The center's director, Dr. Jennifer Thompson Hayes, was the granddaughter of Tom Thompson, who had served as an elder at Harmony Baptist Church during Sarah's lifetime. My grandfather always said that Sarah Whitmore was the most courageous person he had ever met, Dr. Thompson Hayes explained to a group of visiting journalists. He spent 40 years wondering what had happened to her, never knowing that she had died because she wouldn't compromise her principles. Now we're training the next generation of leaders to have that same kind of moral courage. Perhaps the most unexpected development in Willowbrook Springs was the transformation of Robert Eugene Morrison's former home into a community center dedicated to restorative justice and healing. Morrison had died in prison in 2026, just 2 years after his conviction, but not before his property had been seized and sold to pay restitution to the families and organizations that had been victims of the 1980s embezzlement scheme. The Morrison House, as it was now known, hosted support groups for families of crime victims, workshops on ethical leadership, and community meetings focused on preventing corruption and promoting transparency in local government. The irony that Morrison's former home was now being used to promote the very values he had violated was not lost on anyone in the community. Kate Sullivan often visited the Morrison House, where she facilitated a monthly support group for families dealing with cold cases and unsolved crimes. Her experience with Sarah's case had given her unique insights into the long-term impact of unresolved grief and the healing power of truth, even when it came decades too late. The hardest part isn't not knowing what happened, Kate would tell the families in her support group. The hardest part is feeling like your loved one has been forgotten, like their life didn't matter enough for anyone to keep searching for answers. Sarah's case taught me that truth has its own timeline, and justice can come even when we've given up hope. One of the most regular attendees at Kate's support group was David Whitmore, Sarah's cousin, who had been just 8 years old when she disappeared. Now 48 and serving as a federal prosecutor in Memphis, David had dedicated his career to seeking justice for victims who couldn't speak for themselves. Sarah was like a big sister to me, David shared during one of the support group meetings. When she disappeared, I felt like I had lost my hero. Learning the truth about what happened to her was devastating, but it also gave me a sense of purpose. Every case I prosecute, every victim I represent, I'm thinking about Sarah and the justice she deserved but had to wait 40 years to receive. The impact of Sarah's story had also reached beyond Tennessee's borders. Her diary had been published as a book titled Letters to Tomorrow, The Faith and Courage of Sarah Whitmore, with all proceeds going to support the foundation's work. The book had become a bestseller, particularly among Christian readers who were inspired by Sarah's unwavering faith in the face of mortal danger. Book clubs across the country had adopted Sarah's diary as a study guide for discussions about moral courage, faith under pressure, and the responsibility of believers to stand up for justice. Many readers reported that Sarah's example had inspired them to speak up about wrongdoing in their own communities, workplaces, and organizations. One particularly moving testimony came from Rachel Morrison, no relation to Robert Morrison, a high school senior from Oregon who had read Sarah's diary and been inspired to report sexual harassment by a teacher at her school. Despite facing social ostracism and threats from some community members, Rachel had persisted in her allegations, ultimately leading to the teacher's arrest and the discovery that he had been victimizing students for years. "Sarah Whitmore showed me that being young doesn't mean you can't make a difference," Rachel wrote in a letter to the foundation. "Her courage gave me the strength to speak up when I saw injustice, even though I was afraid of the consequences. Because of her example, other students at my school are now safe from a predator." The transformation of Willowbrook Springs itself had been remarkable to witness. The exposure of corruption from the 1980s had led to comprehensive reforms in local government, including new transparency requirements, regular audits of all public expenditures, and citizen oversight committees for major projects. The town had also established an annual Truth and Reconciliation Day, when community members gathered to discuss difficult topics and commit to honesty and integrity in their civic life. Margaret Rose Campbell, now in her early 60s, had become something of a local celebrity, frequently speaking at conferences and events about friendship, loyalty, and the importance of preserving memory. But despite the attention and accolades, she remained focused on the simple truth that had driven her for 40 years. Sarah Whitmore had been her best friend, and she owed it to Sarah's memory to make sure her story was told honestly and completely. "People sometimes ask me if I'm angry about all the years we spent not knowing the truth," Margaret said during a 2029 interview with Christianity Today magazine. "But I've learned that anger doesn't honor Sarah's memory. What honors her memory is using her example to inspire others to choose courage over comfort, truth over convenience, and justice over personal safety." The interview had been conducted in Sarah's bedroom in the Whitmore family home, which had been preserved exactly as it was on the day she disappeared. The house was now owned by the Harmony Baptist Church and operated as a museum and retreat center, with Sarah's room serving as a prayer chapel where visitors could reflect on her life and legacy. The room still contained Sarah's twin bed with its blue floral comforter, her wooden desk where she had written her diary entries, and her bookshelf filled with Christian classics and devotional books. On the desk was a framed copy of the last entry in her diary, along with a small placard that read, "She being dead yet speaketh," Hebrews 11 verse 4. Pastor Harrison often brought visiting pastors and church leaders to Sarah's room, using her story as a teaching tool about the cost of discipleship and the responsibility of believers to confront evil and injustice. The room had become a pilgrimage site of sorts for Christian young people who were struggling with questions about courage, faith, and moral leadership. "Sarah's room reminds us that faith isn't just about personal salvation," Pastor Harrison would tell visitors. "It's about being willing to sacrifice for the well-being of others, even when that sacrifice is costly and the results aren't guaranteed." Sarah couldn't have known that her death would ultimately lead to justice and inspire thousands of people. She acted in faith, trusting that God would use her sacrifice for good. One of the most frequent visitors to Sarah's room was Dr. Emily Chen, a professor of Christian ethics at Vanderbilt University who had written extensively about Sarah's case. Dr. Chen had been particularly interested in the theological implications of Sarah's willingness to face death rather than compromise her principles. "Sarah Whitmore represents a kind of Christian martyrdom that we don't often see in contemporary America," Dr. Chen explained in her book, The Courage of Conviction, Sarah Whitmore and the Ethics of Truth-Telling. "She wasn't killed for refusing to renounce her faith or for preaching the gospel in a hostile environment. She was killed for refusing to be complicit in injustice, for insisting that Christian values should govern public life as well as private devotion." Dr. Chen's analysis had sparked theological discussions in seminaries and Christian colleges across the country. Some scholars argued that Sarah's example demonstrated the prophetic tradition within Christianity, while others focused on her embodiment of Jesus's teachings about speaking truth to power and defending the vulnerable. The 5th anniversary of Sarah's proper burial, in October 2029, was marked by a week-long celebration of her life and legacy in Willowbrook Springs. The events included academic conferences, artistic performances, and worship services, all designed to honor Sarah's memory while inspiring continued commitment to justice and truth. The highlight of the anniversary week was the dedication of a new statue in the town square, depicting Sarah as an 18-year-old girl holding an open Bible, with an inscription that read, "Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore, 1966 to 1984, she chose truth over safety, justice over comfort, and eternal significance over temporary peace. Kate Sullivan was asked to speak at the dedication ceremony, and her remarks captured the profound impact that Sarah's story had on everyone who encountered it. 5 years ago, when we first discovered Sarah's diary, I thought we were simply solving a cold case, Kate said, addressing the crowd of several hundred people who had gathered in the square. I had no idea that we were uncovering a story that would transform a community and inspire people around the world. Kate paused, looking at the faces in the crowd, many of whom had known Sarah personally, others who had been drawn to Willowbrook Springs by her story. Sarah Whitmore was 18 years old when she made the decision that would cost her life but ultimately save her community. She couldn't have imagined the ripple effects of her courage, the lives that would be changed by her example, the corruption that would be exposed by her sacrifice. The detective turned to look at the new statue, bronze gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. But I think Sarah would be most proud of what this community has become, a place where truth is valued over convenience, where justice is pursued even when it's difficult, where young people are encouraged to speak up and stand up for what's right. Kate's voice grew stronger as she concluded her remarks. Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore proved that you don't have to be powerful or wealthy or famous to change the world. You just have to be willing to tell the truth, regardless of the cost. That's a lesson we all need to remember, and it's a legacy we all need to protect. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Margaret Rose Campbell approached the statue for a private moment with her friend's memorial. She placed a single white rose at the base of the bronze figure and whispered the same prayer she had been saying for 45 years. "Thank you, Sarah, for showing me what courage looks like. Thank you for proving that truth is always stronger than lies, that light always conquers darkness, and that love always wins in the end. Rest in peace, my dear friend. Your work here is done, but your legacy will continue forever." The evening sky over Willowbrook Springs was painted in shades of pink and gold as the town settled into peaceful quiet. In homes throughout the community, families gathered around dinner tables where conversations about integrity and courage had become commonplace, inspired by the example of a young woman who had chosen principle over personal safety. At Harmony Baptist Church, Pastor Henderson finished preparing his sermon for the following Sunday, a message about the eternal significance of moral choices and the way that individual acts of courage can echo through generations. On his desk was a copy of Sarah's diary, open to her final entry, serving as a daily reminder of the price of discipleship and the power of unwavering faith. In her house on Elm Street, Kate Sullivan sat in her study, working on her own memoir about the cases that had shaped her career and her understanding of justice. The chapter about Sarah Whitmore was the longest in the book, not because the case had been the most complex, but because it had been the most meaningful. And in the cemetery where Sarah's body now rested in peace, her gravestone caught the last rays of sunlight, illuminating the words that had become a rallying cry for a new generation of young people committed to truth and justice. Her courage echoes through eternity. The story of Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore had begun with a diary hidden in a church basement, but it had become something much larger, a testament to the power of faith, courage, and truth to triumph over evil, even when that triumph takes 40 years to achieve. In a world often cynical about justice and skeptical of heroes, Sarah's story offered hope that individual courage still mattered, that truth would ultimately prevail, and that even the smallest acts of integrity could change the world. As night fell over Willowbrook Springs, the town that had been forever changed by the discovery of one brave girl's diary, residents went to sleep knowing that they lived in a place where truth mattered, where justice prevailed, and where the legacy of Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore continued to inspire new generations to choose courage over comfort, principle over popularity, and eternal significance over temporary peace. The hidden truth had finally been revealed, and its power to transform lives, communities, and hearts would continue for generations to come.